Hi, and welcome to a Super Bloom podcast. Welcome, I am Candice King. Today I'm sitting down with Tracy Clark-Flory. Tracy is a journalist and author of the memoir, Want Me, A Sex Writer's Journey into the Heart of Desire, which New York Times bestselling author Rebecca Traister calls intimate, challenging, and so very smart. And I call a fantastic memoir that everyone should read. And I don't know why I say memoir so strangely. I feel like, when you say a word and it just doesn't sound right in your mouth, memoir. A while back, I'd interviewed Caroline Spiegel, who is the founder and CEO of Quinn, which is an audio porn app that's specifically geared towards women. And so after that, it just really got me so curious on specifically like how women not only approach, their sexuality with partners, but also how they approach it with themselves. And I had been kind of promoted this book, Want Me, A Sex Writer's Journey into the Heart of Desire by Tracy. And I started reading it, and it just was such a beautiful, wonderful, storytelling of Tracy's relationship with sex and how she was taught about sex at a young age, how her perspective on sex evolved as she grew into adulthood, and specifically how she was writing about sex as a journalist and how that was so very different in how she was experiencing sex as a single young woman in her 20s. And so I highly recommend her book. You can get it anywhere. It is such a beautiful read. And what I love about Tracy's memoir is it's not just singularly about sex and sexuality. It's also really a coming of age story. Tracy is incredibly vulnerable about her relationship with her parents, specifically her mom as well, who, Tracy lost. And we'll talk a little bit about that today in this episode. But Tracy has written for Cosmopolitan, Elle, Esquire, Marie Claire, Salon, The Guardian, Women's Health, and so many others, specifically about feminism, gender, motherhood, pop culture, sex, technology, and many more things. If you have read Tracy's book and you're excited to listen to today's episode and you have yet to sign up for her Substack, highly recommend that. If you go to tracyclarkflory.substack.com, that's where you can find Tracy's newsletter on sex, pop culture, and feminism. She's just a fantastic writer and storyteller, and you're going to get such a sense of that today by the end of our interview. So without further ado, please enjoy my interview with Tracy Clark-Flory.
He's going to turn 6 in August. He just graduated from kindergarten. So.
Oh my goodness.
And how many do you have?
I have 2.
2.
Yeah, I have 2 that I gave birth to. I have a 7-year-old and a 2.5-year-old, and they have older sisters too, who are 20 and 17. So I've been blessed to just be surrounded by growing young women
the full
spectrum. I know my joke for so long has been like, I want to start a tampon company or like some sort of feminine products company to get a kickback at this point.
Right.
Because I would like leave Target and they'd be like, what? And just don't ask. Like,
that's so funny. That is amazing. I can picture it.
Man. Yes. But it is it is, especially like watching like my stepdaughters in these like teenage years. What I think is so fascinating is you get this like reflection. You get this like bizarre, you start to see like yourself in them. Like you start to see like their mannerisms, their young adulthood, them kind of like figuring their way. And you just get these like flashes of your own childhood and this like in your own young adulthood and just like this whole other perspective and like of forgiveness for this younger version of yourself that I feel like in my 20s, I just judged her so much. Like I judged my teenage version of myself. I judged my early 20s. And then now kind of watching like these young women in this younger generation, I just have I have so much more forgiveness for my younger self.
That's really amazing. I've often thought like in having a boy that in some ways I feel like I was let off the hook of like, not like I don't need to sort of confront those younger versions of myself and like do probably the work that's inherent in that for you, that it's, of course, there are new challenges with raising a boy, but it just feels so potent, like to raise a girl and revisit that younger self. Wow.
It's definitely, it's a journey. It's
Yeah.
it's definitely, it's been fascinating, which has also led me to even like picking up, like buying your book, and just even like all the words within the title, like want me, and really like your own relationship with like sex and just really desire. And it's so funny. I've talked about it on this podcast that I had started. I'm 36. I've had 2 kids. I have really had to reevaluate my relationship with myself and with my body and like where I place my self-worth. And I've been separated for a while now, and so I've had like more free time when my children go over to their dad's house.
Mm.
And so one of the things that I had picked up is kind of like a hobby, because that's what everyone tells you. Like when you get divorced, they're like, make sure you have a hobby to keep you sane. And one of my hobbies I picked up was dancing, like a hip hop dance class,
Oh, interesting.
to get back into something that I remember being fun and that I missed doing and that made me feel confident when I was younger. And then now in adulthood has like completely scared me. And I realized that there was an element of that, of like wanting to do this like ridiculous hip hop class that made me want to feel like I was taking charge of like feeling sexy again. That like, that I'd focused so much on like this visual of like how it would look externally, even though I was still focused on like how would I be seen? How would I be desired? How would the physical movement of my body be seen like from a public eye of like being sexy, as opposed to what I should have been doing and what I ended up doing, which is actually getting back in touch with myself and what feels good and what makes me feel confident. And it has nothing to do with anyone else and how they see me, but how I feel within myself. And your book is so much rooted in that, this ridiculous kind of like our relationship with being desired versus like what we actually desire. And you talk about a lot about your relationship to sex in like your discovery of like your body and sexuality as like a young kid. Could you maybe share with us a little bit on why you wanted to kind of start with your teenage years in a book about desire and sex and being wanted?
Yeah, absolutely. And I also really relate to the hip hop dance aspirations. That's actually an aspiration I've never realized. I've actually always held that as this, if I could do that and really like there's something about dance that requires a letting go and like allowing yourself to be foolish and not cool potentially. So that really resonates with me, like as a high aspiration, the ability to like really be in your body in that way and be loose with it and not be stuck in that outside perspective watching yourself. But maybe one day I'll get there. So kudos to you that you're taking the dance class. But I started with my younger years because that's where so much of the indoctrination happens. And so, when I grew up in Berkeley, California, I was raised by a couple of Berkeley hippies. It was ostensibly a very sex positive household where they really spoke about sex in glowing terms. It was talked about as this almost like spiritual level event. My dad especially was very outspoken with feminist beliefs. And he would tell me things like, what matters is a woman's brain, not her looks. A woman's most attractive feature is her brain. You can be anything you want to be, that kind of messaging. And then at the same time, I was like glued to the TV and watching MTV around the clock, like spring break specials and late night. Yeah. Girls Gone Wild infomercials and like staying up late to watch late night HBO and see strip clubs on TV. And like, it felt like I was getting one message at home from my hippie sex positive parents. And then this other message from the culture at large that was like very much this like, sexualized frat party. It felt like I kind of held out hope that there were men out there like my dad who seemed to think that like, what made a woman attractive was her brain, and that the frat party of pop culture was not all there was. And that I might be able to, as a, heterosexual woman, find a partner who appreciated me for all that I was. A sort of inciting incident of my book is finding my dad's porn or his browser history, where he had subscribed to perfect10.com. And so this idea of like my dad, who told me that what matters is my brain, is like subscribing to a website and a magazine that is rating women on a 1 to 10 scale. It was like, mind blowing and very disillusioning, because it felt like if even my feminist father, who I knew was unusual, but if even he is this way, then what does that mean for the rest of men? And what does that mean for me as a young woman growing up in this world and trying to find a partner? So really that was part of what set me off on this journey to kind of ostensibly understand straight men's desire in this hope to kind of master it, to maybe, become it, or at least understand it, because that really felt like power to me. But it was like along the way of that journey that I was able to get more in touch with my own desires. So starting in the teenage years felt so fundamental, because that was where like all of that, the conflict and the contradictory messages began.
I always wonder, like, for our moms, they have like their own version of like their generation of feminism, and it was kind of my interpretation from my relationship with my mother and our conversation was this idea that like feminism rooted in like women getting into the workplace, like that it was all rooted in that, like women in workplace. You talk about it so perfectly. We're also the first generation that really, became saturated with porn online. We are the dial-up generation who suddenly this was not just Playboy magazines found, dusty behind, in old drawers. This has opened up a whole new world of Google and seeing things immediately and whatever you want. And all of the porn was geared in, for so long towards the male gaze. And it is not that surprising that like our generation kind of came up wondering like what do men want? What is the role that we have to be, while also claiming some sort of like feminism like that's rooted in like the one night stand almost. Like I don't know if you can put all those pieces together. You did it much better in your book than what I'm doing now.
To me, it's that we're this generation that has grown up with the lie of liberation, that we've grown up believing that the sexual revolution was fought and won, and that, freedom is ours for the taking. And that's a lie. And it's also this very neoliberal notion of empowerment that's all about the individual, that, as an individual, that you can make the right set of choices and become empowered, as opposed to like the original definition of empowerment, feminist definition of empowerment, was about collective struggle for collective gain. It was about improving everyone's situation. It was about, overcoming those systemic hurdles together. It was not about savvily navigating the world on your own. And so we've moved very much towards this more commercialized vision of feminism that is much more about performing empowerment. And so I think that's extremely confusing. And I found that impossible to parse as I was going through it. And it was really only once I felt like I had a safe distance from it that I could look back and understand that so much of what I was doing was trying to perform the part of this, sexually liberated woman, when the reality was that there were still so many constraints in the world, that I was like, not sort of, unencumbered and awash with pleasure, that I was faking all of my orgasms with all of my partners when I was hooking up. And that, in that moment in my 20s, it felt like enough that I was like, I can go out there and have sex like a man, and I can have one night stands, and survive it almost, and sort of perform this vision of this like sexually empowered woman who's like multi-orgasmic and like all of these things, when that wasn't the truth. It was a performance. It was a fantasy.
My 20s, I feel like that was something that was very talked about a lot. You know, and again, and this is not, look, I've seen every episode of Sex and the City a million times. I've even been watching the reboot of it, but like, it was this notion of like, you know, the Samanthas of the, you know, of the world, like, you know, she's having sex like a man and so can I, and I'm going to enjoy it every single time. But like, even if I'm not enjoying it, but I still want to be, and it's almost like you get to take your authority back over it in the recounting of trying to tell your friends over brunch. You know, this kind of like notion that you can tell your friends about it the next day at brunch, just like they do. And it's almost like you take your power back. I just loved how much you were also open with the fact that, yeah, this was a time that you were not only, you started writing about sex in this very free way, but also you at that time were faking your orgasms, which is just so like on the nose of exactly what we're talking about, like the idea as opposed to the reality, but also how pop culture influences the way that we think about sex. I mean, I remember every single main movie that I watched in high school was all about the whole point of like senior year leading up to prom, and the whole thing that you have to do before you go off into college years is lose your virginity. You know, it's like the fact that this was like a very typical plot point of almost every single teen movie at that time of like the late 90s, early aughts. I mean, even the 80s, that was like a whole part of it. And none of it is rooted in pleasure, in intimacy, in consent, in a conversation with yourself of like what you actually desire. When you were young and you started having sex with her, you write about it in your book, but what was your idea of sex at that time?
I mean, my idea of sex came from a multitude of influences. It was early internet porn. It was those late night HBO TV shows, you know, which mostly involved women, you know, women dancing for men, that kind of thing. It was very much for catering to the male gaze. It was MTV spring break specials and, you know, girls competing in wet t-shirt contests during spring break. Like all of that stuff, even the stuff that was not sex itself, communicated something to me about what sex was about, right? Like it communicated what the power dynamic, the essential power dynamic of sex was, which to me was women catering to men's desires and performing for men. And so I went into sex with not just those like abstract ideas about sex, but also like very concrete visual ideas about what sex looked like, which is so different from when I think about like my mom's generation. When she first had sex, she'd never seen it before. And I'd seen it countless times and like very explicit examples of it. And to me, that's a really interesting generational change to be able to go into sex and not be discovering it for the first time, to go into sex and to feel like you're part of, like the act of sex is part of the culture, because like pornography is part of our culture. It's one of our most, you know, the most popular forms of mass media that there is. You know, to me, sex felt like participating in the culture in the same way that like, you know, a wet t-shirt contest felt like participating in the culture. Like it was part of the conversation about sex and about, you know, gender differences and power. And I certainly went into it with a very strong idea of what it was. And it took a very, very long time to get to a place where I could really explore my own ideas of what sex was and what it could be and what I wanted from it.
And what's interesting is I feel like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but that didn't necessarily even come from writing about sex. Like you started writing. How old were you when you started writing about sex? You were in college, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, even as far back as high school, I was always drawn to the topic. But definitely during college, for the school newspaper, I was writing about porn and sex, and yeah. So from, you know, very early 20s or late teens, yeah.
Why sex?
I mean, I have a very long answer for that.
Did you pitch it, or were they like, we want you to write about it?
It's always been the thing that I've been drawn to. And it's a very funny thing because I'm, you know, a fairly shy and reserved person. And so for me to be like, to go out and demand or ask for something is remarkable. And it's always been the thing that I've pushed towards. So that was true in college, writing for the newspaper. It was true when I got my first internship at an online magazine. Like, it was always the topic that I was drawn to. And, I see that as partly a result of growing up in the, hippie, sex positive household in Berkeley that I grew up in, and feeling like a sense of permission to write about sex and to not feel like my family was going to disown me. But it also, I think, arose from the kind of contradictions that I detected early on, where I was seeing like my family is telling me one thing, the culture is telling me this other thing, like what is the truth, and wanting to like really dial into that. But more recently, I've realized that there's this even deeper level to it, I think, which is that, and I mentioned this only very briefly in Want Me, but I'm actually now working on a second book that's about this. But my mom, when she was 18 years old, got pregnant and was sent away to a home for unwed mothers. It was 1965. This was what they did back then. Young women were sent away, hidden away. The proof of their illicit sexuality was hidden behind closed doors. And then they were coerced essentially towards adoption. And I've come to realize, because I recently actually found my sister, who my mom placed for adoption, through a DNA test. And
wow.
And
because they burned so many of those records back
then. They did. And it was like impossible to reconnect, and the adoptions were closed. And so for me, it was as easy as spitting in a vial and dropping it in the mailbox. And I found my sister. And so this has been this amazing experience that's unfolded for me over the last year and a half now. And part of that experience has been doing some research around what happened to our mom and being sent away. And I've had this sort of cascade of realizations around the fact that my mom was sent away in shame in response to her sexuality. And she was told to hide it from her friends and family and community, to pretend it had never happened, to never talk about it again. And it destroyed her in so many ways. And I realized that, like, I've organized my life around writing and speaking publicly about sex, and sort of pursuing this, aim of shamelessness, that I've like arranged my life around it in this really kind of dramatic way. And I think I used to think that that was like an ironic, like there was some poetic irony to that, or that it was a coincidence. And now I realize that it was not a coincidence, that it is very much was in response to what happened to my mom. And so now I see that as like, I've been so driven to write about this topic, because it feels like writing honestly about sex, speaking the truth about sex, feels like survival to me. It feels like I know what happened to my mom from being silent. And it feels like I've been trying to do the exact opposite and put it all out there.
You could feel the weight of the shame that your mom carried because of which was the shame placed on her.
Yes, exactly. I saw the shame and the pain and the like enduring trauma from this like social institutional response to premarital sex. And then like, lo and behold, like I go out there as a 20-something, and like one of my big splashiest personal essays that I wrote at the beginning of my career was an essay that was titled "In Defense of Casual Sex." And it's like, I am my mother's daughter. Like I am in some ways, it feels like a continuation of that story in a very powerful way.
I'm so glad that you referenced, I am obsessed with this topic, and I love Ann Fessler's book so much, The Girls Who Went Away. Yes. And the second I saw that you referenced it, I was like, because I just feel like the fact that no one really talks about this chapter of history that affected so many families, especially given what's going on in the state of the country right now, with so many states who are attacking women's healthcare. All that to say, all I'm thinking about as you're talking about this as well is in the moment that you email your mom, kind of wondering if you're weird, in talking about sex. Correct me, is this you had been dating someone at the time? Like, can you share a little bit Because especially given that like your mom's ability to basically be faced with you kind of wrestling like whether you should feel ashamed or not because of the way you were discovering sex and you in your relationship with like what sex means to you, and for your mother in that moment to just say you're not weird, like
Yeah.
to just have that, be able to remove that, take that
Yeah.
weight away from you.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I was like 24 and I had been in a long distance relationship with a wonderful guy. But I felt that there was something essentially missing in the relationship. And he was on paper like all of the things that I wanted, but he wasn't able to communicate about sex from a distance. And I wasn't able, it didn't feel right to me to be in a relationship and not have sex be part of our relationship, even though we were physically apart. And I kept sort of questioning that sense of dissatisfaction and, felt like, well, look, on paper, it's all the things that you want, right? Unfortunately, I did end up cheating on him and I, was very ashamed and the relationship ended up, falling apart, not too surprisingly. In that sort of moment of grief immediately after, I emailed my mom and I said like, basically she had no idea that these were all these things that I felt lacking in the relationship. And, was I wrong for having wanted more? And, was I a weirdo for
And
feeling
more
like,
desire, more sexual
yeah,
connection, more
more.
able to explore different boundaries within your sex life
Yeah.
together as a partnership.
Yes, yes. And yeah, am I a weirdo? She'd written back this very long, thoughtful email. And one of the things that she said in it was, somewhere in you is the answer for what is right for you. Because I'd kind of been casting about of like, oh no, and I was using very much the rhetoric of the time, which at that time in the 2000s, there was like all this language around, young women, like not settling down and ending up sad and alone and like and those messages had really gotten to me. And so I was like, am I gonna end up a lonely cat lady? Like, it's just like so overwrought and fearful. And she was very solid and comforting of like, what is right for you, and really affirmed that I did need something more. And then she'd sent that email and then like moments later she wrote a PS and it was, you are not a weirdo. and And, I think that really came from a place, I know that came from a place for her of feeling like a weirdo, for feeling abnormal as a woman, for having desire, which of course was partly instilled in her from her experience of being sent away, but is also shared by so many of us. And it was a really beautiful thing to be able to have that kind of conversation, honestly, with my mom and to hear, you are not a weirdo.
It's so funny because I think about like, even just this idea basically of if you're this like single young woman, especially in your 20s, to desire to desire sex and be sexual and be curious, and then also sometimes like, did you ever find a time or position? I think, and I have a feeling, yes, just based off of reading your book, but just to share where like you at the start of a relationship were this very sex forward, sex positive person, and then once you're in the relationship, you know all of a sudden maybe being shamed for that within,
Mm-hmm.
you know what I mean, this like
Yeah.
constant pressure, I think, on so many women, especially young women in their 20s who might be met with an insecure partner and an insecure, not to generalize men, but just someone, if you end up partnered with someone who might be insecure at that time, especially when everyone's young and everyone's figuring it out, but how quickly it can be turned against the woman, like the Madonna and the whore thing. It's
Oh, yeah.
like you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't, and it can be
Yes.
so confusing. And especially when you don't even like have a relationship with yourself to know what you want yet, because society has told you like the whole object of the game is to be desired
Mm-hmm.
and to be chosen and to get the final rose,
Yeah,
per
yes,
se.
yes. Yeah, when I remember in my 20s, like when I was like, officially minted as a sex writer, I remember thinking that it was so funny that like men were not interested in talking to me about being a sex writer. Like they didn't want to hear about it or know about it. Like they weren't impressed by it. Like, to generalize, of course, there were some exceptions, like people I actually got into relationships with who were wonderful. But like, I remember thinking how interesting it was that, like, it feels so often like we're pushed towards like, being sexy and open and free. But then actually it felt like, men weren't interested in that part of it. Like that was like, it was intimidating or scary. And I think that speaks to the mixed messages that we get. Like there are these wonderful feminist researchers who've really mapped out how the traditional virgin slut dichotomy has endured over the decades, but it's also morphed. So it's become this like minefield, essentially, where it used to be a tightrope, but now it's more of a minefield where it's not just virgin slut. It's also don't be a prude. There are these pressures towards being sexy, but not too sexy. But no one knows what's too sexy. So it's just like you're never actually safe. Every sort of step is potentially perilous, like as a young woman trying to navigate just the right balance of things there. And then alongside of that, there are all these pressures towards performing empowerment, like we were talking about, like of playing the part of the sexually liberated woman, which researchers have found actually has turned into this a way of defending yourself against like perceptions of being a slut. So like you can have sex, but if you're real empowered about it, you're not a slut. But if you're being taken advantage of, or if you're somehow not empowered about it, then that's what a slut. So the definition of what it means to be a slut has morphed and changed in all of these ways that puts all the more pressure on seeming empowered and, in charge.
Which is like, but again, what does that mean?
Yeah.
Like, according to someone else, which really just brings it all back to like, if we could all take a moment to really start with ourselves and get to know ourselves before we have an idea of like who we should be for anyone else. And that, I think, is what I hope for this younger generation of women to like really be able to get in touch with their like what they want and how they see themselves before they suddenly bring anyone else's perspective or desire into it. When was your big shift? Like, when did you go from being this like very free, sex positive, sex journalist who was faking her orgasms to all of a sudden saying, no, I don't want to do this anymore. I want to be more connected with myself. And when did you kind of get back home to the root of who you were to start learning about your personal desire and how to build a relationship with that?
I feel like it kind of coincided with a lot of different things. My mom was diagnosed with terminal cancer, and I must have been 26 at the time, I want to say. And I went through obviously a really difficult, challenging time where I actually, turned to sex as a way of sort of experiencing pain, of like manifesting this like all consuming pain and preemptive grief that I was experiencing physically as physical pain. And so it, looking back feels like it was a pretty destructive period in my life. And I think, there was part of that where I moved through that and went to a very dark place and eventually emerged on the other side, feeling like I was no longer interested in self-annihilation. And, I had gone to this very dramatic place, but it actually felt like it was a continuation of like so much of what I'd kind of been doing to myself and what our culture does to us as women in my, performing for men's desire, in my silencing my own, authentic desire and not experiencing pleasure. And so I just, at the other side of that, I felt so done with that. And I started craving intimacy and pleasure. And I ended up getting into a relationship where I felt very safe with like a wonderful and kind man. I had started our relationship faking orgasms and very much performing pleasure, but it felt like a safe place for me to start exploring the idea of like, what if I stopped performing? And so that was really the start of beginning to tune into what I wanted, what felt good in my own body, and even just like asking for this space to explore that with someone else. so that was the start. And it was, it was a journey from then on, going forward into my relationship with my husband, who was a man who was very unlike any of what I'd sort of grown up expecting from men. Like, for example, he wanted to wait to have sex. Like, he actually, like, he was the one that felt the need to kind of establish more intimacy before we got physical. And it challenged all of my ideas about how things were supposed to go. I think those challenging moments, those moments that kind of debunk your ideas about sex helped me to move along in my journey towards myself, because I realized in a lot of ways, like, I'd been performing this idea of what men wanted, but it wasn't necessarily what men wanted. And that was also part of what I discovered in my work as a sex writer, especially reporting on the porn industry. Like, one of the big moments in the book is, like, I'm on a porn set and I'm chatting behind the scenes with this performer who I grew up watching, who helped to form my idea of what sex was. And he was backstage going, I don't like to have sex like this in my real life. Like, girls these days think that, like, this is what sex is. It's not what sex is. Like, and it was so illuminating to me.
You were like, what? It's like finding out Santa Claus isn't real. You're like, what?
Exactly. It reminded me of this experience I'd had as a little kid when there'd been some kind of like wardrobe malfunction with Minnie Mouse. And I realized that, like, oh my God, there's a person inside that costume. It was like,
yes.
And so similarly, it was like, and by that point I knew, it's like, rationally, I knew that porn was fantasy. I'd reported on it for years, but there was still this like little, adolescent version of myself inside of me that still held on to it as some essential truth. And so that was like a really powerful moment. And I kept having moments, like smaller moments like that throughout my career as a reporter, talking to men, talking to women, talking about sex, having these honest conversations, hearing people's most private thoughts, and realizing that there was so much to this experience, so much nuance, so much individuality, that like the ideas that we hold about sex, what it should be, what's hot, what men want, what women want, are so false. And it's such a waste of time trying to perform this idea, this fantasy. So that was an essential piece of it too, was like the kind of education that I got from my career. It was like the kind of sex education that we all should get as young people, but I had to get it through, 15 years reporting on sex, like, unfortunately. But when you realize how false these sort of aspirations are, like, it makes it so much easier to let go of it and to try to start with a blank slate and create it yourself. Like, what is sex? What is desire? What do I want?
I'd love to hear your thoughts on how your perspective, especially as someone who your career broke over an article about casual sex, and now you're married, have been married for 7 year.
We're coming up on 10.
Oh, 10 years. Jeez, I was way off on whatever Instagram photo I saw was way off. So coming up on 10 years, which I'm sure, you've had a completely different relationship with your understanding of sex, even within the realm of, monogamy, partnership, and also within having a child together as well. What is, what's probably been the biggest shift in the way that you see sex and intimacy as in marriage or within a monogamous long-term relationship?
To me, it's really about adapting to all of the shifts in your relationship. I mean, especially like if I think about from when we first got together, all of those sort of life events that happen along the way from the beginning of our relationship. My mom died 2 months before we got together. Like, these big moments of like grief, or, then having a baby, like, which completely consumes your life, and sex, disappears for a little while, or even like rediscovering sex as a pregnant person. Like, I didn't know how to do that. I didn't know what that looked like, So it's like really been adapting to it in different phases. Like, there are different sort of passing fantasies or interests. And so it's really like, to me, the most important thing has been being able to talk about those shifts and changes, including the fact that parenthood often feels so consuming and is so exhausting that sometimes it doesn't feel like there's a lot of space for sex. And sometimes sex actually comes to feel like a burden or a task, and like even to be able to talk about that and even to be able to schedule it, like to make the space for it and to not have unrealistic expectations of like, we're just going to be overcome with desire in the midst of this domestic scene of childcare. Like, that's not going to happen. Like, it's not very sexy, it's not very sexy. Like, the sort of, in my experience, marriage can be very transactional. It's like, okay, can you take the kid? Okay, now I'll take the kid. So I can get some time on my own. And like this constant navigation and negotiation, and, it doesn't really set the stage very well. So like, it's been a new phase of like letting go of those expectations of what it should be. I would say like the lessons that I learned through that journey throughout my 20s have proven to be very useful now too. And just the like letting go of the narrative of what it should be and allowing yourselves to like co-create something together.
What would Tracy in her early 20s writing your piece about casual sex, what would that Tracy, how would she define intimacy?
Ooh. That Tracy was not very comfortable with intimacy at all. Yeah. I mean, how would she have defined intimacy? I think that younger version of myself longed for emotional intimacy. I think I didn't know so much what sexual intimacy looked like. And it's interesting to have, I think I felt so comfortable with getting really deep into emotions with a partner and feeling so vulnerable in that way. But I didn't know, I had no sort of experience or context for like the kind of vulnerability, physical vulnerability of sex and emotional vulnerability of sex. Like I just wasn't familiar with it. And so I think probably I would have really defined intimacy as like the emotional piece of it, but I didn't have a vision for what the physical side of it really would look like. Yeah. That was one of the main things I think in my journey throughout my 20s was like this sort of beginning to long for intimacy in sex. Like it actually hadn't been something that I'd been in pursuit of at all. Sex had felt much more like something that was like performance and play, which it can be, but it doesn't have to only be that.
How do you define intimacy, relational intimacy, sexual intimacy today?
To me, it feels so essential to be able to be honest about my desires, to not have to feel like there's any part of myself that I have to hide, and to kind of like we've established that in our relationship, that we can talk about our desires openly and candidly and laugh about them. Like that we've set that sort of standard and expectation. And to me, I think there's something so intimate and important about being able to reveal that full self to my partner and be accepted, especially as a woman, having received so many messages around being a weirdo, like we were talking about, like for wanting sex at all. And so to me, there is a profound intimacy in being able to talk about those things candidly and openly, and to feel like there's nothing that's off limits. So it's that sharing, that uncensored sharing, that most core to me.
For anyone who's been in a long-term relationship and a monogamous relationship for a very long time, especially couples with children, it becomes the conversation of keeping the spark alive or trying to make time to like, just, like the quantity of sex somehow equals the quality of the relationship. And I don't know when we decided that that's like what intimacy is as a society. You know what I mean? That the act of it actually means that like you're actually connected. And so I think that that's so beautiful what you just said, because some couples I know who like, just women I know who talk about it, that their ability to share with their partner, just be their full selves and
Mhm.
and just be vulnerable is like such a deeper form of intimacy for their relationship than the actual act.
Well, and like that whole thing of like, how often are you having sex? And like, can feel so much like that performative stuff that we were talking about, where it's
Mhm.
like, it's not about like the actual, like authentic experience of it. It's about some idea of it. It's about like keeping up with some idea of how it's supposed to be. It's like, that's like the worst measure possible is like how often you're having sex, I mean, yes, it can feel very important, and like those, desire discrepancies in relationships, or, that's a very serious issue for a lot of folks. And like, so it's not to discount that, but it's like, it's so not the most essential and important thing.
For anyone that is listening who maybe hasn't taken a moment to kind of reconnect with their own self, or who has found themselves kind of what you were describing, like in a place where they had been maybe faking their orgasms and not really like in tune of their desire, what they want, or even how to communicate what they want. As a sex journalist, what have you discovered over the years as maybe a place that someone can start to even like how someone can start engaging with discovering what they want and how they could go about sharing that with the partner eventually?
Yeah. The most basic thing, the most, I think, important place to start, I think immediately of, there's this sex researcher, Lori Brotto, who I hope I'm getting this right, but she's done these group exercises where she has women essentially engage in mindfulness. And it's maybe sounds silly, but like they're literally taking a raisin and they're like holding the raisin up and looking at the raisin and like observing what the raisin looks like noting, like all of the texture and how it feels between their fingers. And then they like slowly progress to like smelling and then tasting and like feeling, like what does it feel like on the tongue? What is like the flavor? Like, and it's like this exercise of noticing and experiencing and being present. And it's not sexual. It's just a raisin. And
And everyone's like, what do you
I
do
mean,
with
it
the
could be
raisin?
sexual. It
Like,
could be
where are we
sexual.
going with it?
Do whatever you want with the raisin. But it's like it's the tuning in, and I think they've actually done research around it, and it's really profoundly helpful, these kind of mindful exercises, to get people into their bodies.
Mhm.
Because when you get outside of your body and you're like, this idea of like, I need to have an orgasm, and how do I look from this angle, and like all of that, where you're like this like third person in the room watching yourself having sex, as opposed to just being in your body and allowing whatever happens to happen, like whatever sensations arise or don't arise, like to like let that happen without judgment. So related to that, to me, the other essential piece is this idea of like sex without a goal. And that can be sex on your own, it can be sex with a partner, but just this idea of tuning into sensations and without expectation. Like, what does this feel like? What am I thinking about in my brain? Like just being present with whatever is going on in your body, in your mind, just allowing yourself to follow that without this sort of finish line in mind. And that was how I, quote unquote, unlocked my orgasm in my 20s, was like when I was with that partner who I'd initially started by faking with him. And then I decided, I actually didn't, unfortunately, looking back, like I didn't communicate to him, like, I've been faking my orgasms, I want to stop faking my orgasms, which is actually what I would recommend. But instead, what I did was I tried to engineer all these different exercises that we did together. We're like, oh, I want to delay orgasm. And like,
I feel like there's a word. Wasn't there like a trend of like, I don't know, never mind. But like there was words. There was like the words for it for a while,
yes,
right? Like
yes.
edging or
Oh
something.
yes, yes. So I basically like pretended like that's what I was doing, when in reality I was like trying to have an authentic orgasm for a change. What really worked for me was actually Dan Savage, the sex advice columnist, had asked me to help a letter writer to answer a letter writer's question. And it was a young woman who was struggling with orgasms, much like myself. And so I gave her advice based on what I'd learned in my job speaking with sex researchers. And it was essentially this like taking away the finish line. And it was so funny that in giving this other young woman this advice, I was able to actually take it myself. And so I literally, that advice column published. And then I had my first authentic orgasm with my partner at the time. So it was like, it really was like, that was the thing that unlocked it for me was, oh, like, I don't have to be working towards this thing. I can actually just be present in this experience and see what happens. And sometimes you surprise yourself, and when you take away the finish line, that's exactly when you reach it.
Well, I'm so grateful to have found your book. You know, we're the same age. I grew up watching all the same things you did. I grew up with, there were so many things that it just helped me have a much better understanding of how, you know, that specific, growing up during that specific time period has kind of, you know, put this, like how it kind of curated an idea of sex and sexuality within my own life, and kind of put the, like, cast a very clear idea of it, you know, cast a shadow of what I thought it was supposed to look like, instead of just really really understanding it for myself. And thank you for hanging out with us today. And I could talk to you for hours. So that's why I'm like, I don't even have a smooth way to end this, because I still have like a million other questions I would ask you and talk to you about. But I do end each one of these with asking my guests 5 little easy questions, just as a little conversation cool down. And so just the first kind of things that come to your head, word or sentence. But Tracy, what is something that you like?
Water, the ocean.
I thought for a second, I was like, are you just super hydrated all the time? You just drink a lot of...
No, I'm not one of those people. No, I love being in bodies of water. Yeah.
Something that you know.
Something that I know. Nothing, apparently. I love my son. I just, my eyes immediately went to his sweet little face in a framed photo on my desk. So I know that.
Something that you hate.
Dishonesty, lies, secrecy.
Something that you love that is not family, friends, something that you love.
Reading.
And then a quirky little fact about you.
When I was 13 years old, I ran a daily Leonardo DiCaprio newsletter with over 1,000 subscribers, where young women from all over the world would send me clippings from like Australian magazines of like Leo photos or Leo news. And I'd collect it all in my newsletter and send it out every single day.
I love it. What do you think of modern day Leo? Is that for a different podcast episode?
Not a fan. Okay.
Is that going to be your third book?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, no, it's like 1997 Leo for me.
Yeah. I get that. Well, Tracy, thank you so much.
Thank you.
This has been a Super Bloom podcast, hosted by me, Candice King, produced by Melissa D. Montz and Diamond Imprint Productions, and advertisement partnerships with Acast.